This is a video about the family of my paternal grandmother, Phoebe Godburn. I was born in her house in 1946 in Rotherham in South Yorkshire. The Godburns that I knew, principally the siblings of my grandmother, were a happy, sociable lot. When there were any get-togethers, they would always joke and make light of things. But the story of the Godburns was not always happy, as we will see. They had their fair share of poverty, hardship, and at times suffering. But they pulled through, as most working people normally do. There are a lot of blanks in this story. There are times when people disappear and then reappear, and there are periods when I don't really know where people are and what they're doing. The American part of this video, for example, relies solely on records that I could glean from Ancestry.com. So, if anybody watching has any information you would like to add, anecdotes, stories, or even photos, I will redo the video and make the additions and corrections and repost it on YouTube. Okay, so without further ado, let's start. The first mention I could find of a Godburn was the birth of William Morton Godburn in Sheffield in 1816. He was baptized in the Sheffield Cathedral of St. Peter's. William Morton Godburn was married in 1839 to a woman from Rotherham called Anne Sanderson. In the 1841 census, we could see that William and Anne were living in Hammond Street, well, in a court off Hammond Street, and they had 2 children, and William was working as a fork grinder. The Godburns lived in what was officially called Ecclesall Bierlow or Netherthorpe, but everybody called it the Cross, and it was called the Cross because a lot of the streets at that time in the area were called Croft, like Hollis Croft, Peacroft, Sims Croft, and so on. This area was a maze of courtyards, generals, squares, alleyways, anywhere where they could fit a house or a dwelling, and intermingled with the houses were the various workshops of the cutlery business. This particular court, called Sanborn Square, was big enough to be called a square. It was the biggest of the courts in the area, and as you can see, it had two entrances, one at the bottom, which was Edward Street, and Edward Street is where my grandmother Phoebe Godburn was born in 1893. If you look at the street, you can see in the centre where the latrines are, and the latrines were communal, and at that time they were just simply dirt toilets. I don't know if they were ever converted to water toilets, but I doubt it. Conditions must have been, to put it mildly, primitive. The night soil, as it was euphemistically called, was collected every evening by these gentlemen, who took it to the various farms in the outlying area where it was used as manure. Only water in the area was from these pumps which were in the street. If you wanted a bath or water for anything, washing yourself or washing your clothes, you had to go to these pumps and take it back to where you lived. Most of these houses were shared. They were not just one family. Quite often you found a house with 4 rooms and there was a family in each room. In the yard you can see from these photographs that there are lots of tubs, barrels and mangles, and these were also for communal use, and people would, I imagine, wash communally when it was a good day. All the family would get out and help with the washing. I'm old enough to remember the days myself before washing machines, and this is what we did in my grandmother's kitchen. I remember one day getting my thumb stuck in the mangle and had to go to hospital to get it seen to. From the 1851 and the 1861 censuses, we can see that the Godburn family, was still living in Hammond Street, and William Godburn Sr. was working as a fork forger. And from these two censuses, we can make out a basic family tree. And from the family tree, you can see that they had in total 9 children, 3 of whom died as infants, and 6 survived. One of those 6, the youngest, Joseph, lived until he was 93. He never married, and he spent a lot of his years in the Sheffield workhouse. And I always suspected that there was something different about Joseph. I don't know what it is, but he did work. He worked as a labourer. He ended up working on a farm, and he died in 1952. Of the other 5, all of them got married and had families. In 1864, disaster struck. William Morton Godburn died at the age of 48, which may seem quite young for today, but in the middle of the 19th century, and particularly in the cutlery industry, this was more or less normal. The cutlery industry was dangerous, and unhealthy, as we'll see later. But this wasn't only a personal disaster for the Godburns. It was also an economic disaster. Not only had they lost their father and their husband, but they'd also lost the main breadwinner. And although sisters Harriet and Ellen were doing jobs, it wasn't enough to keep the family. In Victorian England, you worked, or you starved, or you went to the dreaded workhouse. So something had to change. Later in 1864, Harriet married Samuel Howe and moved out. The following year, in 1865, Helen married Sampson Ford and also moved out. The remaining sister, Anne, married in 1870 to Albert Smith, and they too moved out. In the 1871 census, we can see that the three brothers, Tom, Bill and Joe, were now living with their sister Anne and Albert Smith in Barbanook. What is strange about this census is that Albert Smith, Anne's husband, is listed as son-in-law, which makes me think that Anne Godburn, the mother, was living there with them as head of the family, although at the moment of counting the people in the different houses, she was somewhere else, and we can find her living round the corner, and I say living, I think she was just visiting and working as a servant in St. Philip's Road. Helen and her husband, Sampson Ford, are living in Harmer Street next to the Midland Railway Station, where her husband is working as a carter. So, in 1871, the three brothers were living with their sister Anne and their husband Albert Smith, along with their mother Anne Godburn, all in Barbanook. And Ellen was living near the railway station with her husband Sampson. Now, the big question is, where is Harriet? I finally found Sister Harriet in the 1880 the United States Census, living with her husband Samuel Howe and her 10 children in Wallingford in Connecticut. I've no idea why they emigrated, and I've no idea where they stayed when they were in Massachusetts. It looks as if they moved to Wallingford in around 1868 or 1869. In the census, Samuel is down as being a solderer of Britta. And Britta is short for Britannia, and Britannia is a kind of metal, a mixture of, it's an alloy of pewter, and it's used for various types of tableware. It's not like silver, obviously, but it's a very decorative piece. I believe that the original Oscars of the ceremonies were made of this metal. It could also mean that he was working at the Britannia factory in Meriden, but I somehow don't think he was. There were quite a few factories in Wallingford at that time working with this metal. His son, William, is also working with him, and it looks as if they were quite settled. Wallingford is a nice town. It's a small town in Connecticut. Although it had factories, the houses and the streets were very pleasant. There was plenty of space, there was plenty of countryside, and it seemed to be the ideal place to bring up a family. Back in England in the 1870s, Harriet's brothers Tom and Bill were working in the cutlery industry like their father. Tom was a knife hafter, and a hafter is somebody who makes the handle part of the knife. And Bill was working as a grinder. Grinding was one of, if not the most deadly profession you could have in Victorian England. An early death was almost guaranteed. The working conditions inside the cutlery industry in Sheffield were so bad, there was even a popular song at the time dedicated to the working conditions of the grinders.
To be a Sheffield grinder, it is no easy trade. There's more than you'd imagine in the grinding of a blade. The strongest man among us is old at 32. There's few who brave such hardships as we poor grinders do. When the country goes to war, our masters quickly cry. Orders countermanded, our goods we all lay by. Your prices we must settle, and you'll be stinted too. There's few suffer such hardships as we poor grinders do. Every working day we are breathing dust and steel, and a broken stone can give us a wound that will not heal. There's many an honest grinder ground down by such a blow. There's few that brave such hardships as we.
In the 1870s, the two brothers, Tom and Bill, both got married. Tom married a woman from Middlesex called Rosina or Rose in 1873. In 1871, Bill, my great-great-grandfather, married Elizabeth Brown, and this is her or their wedding certificate. And as you can see, there are one or two things that don't make sense. One of them is that Bill's age is down as 19 when in fact he was only 18, and Elizabeth Brown's age is down as 18 when all the records show that she was 16. The other thing, which is really not so surprising, is that Elizabeth was 4 months pregnant, which meant that when the baby was conceived, Elizabeth was barely 16, if that, which was a very young age to get married, even in those days. Curiously, this is an excerpt from the British Medical Journal in March of 1857 about precisely the grinders in Sheffield, and one of the doctors here makes a note, and he says, "There is yet in Sheffield another very lamentable source of dissipation and wretchedness amongst its artisans. I allude to early marriages. How to support a wife never appears for one moment to enter into the calculations of the boys who get married. Many of the grinders select their partners for life from girls from a very early age, who have been employed in warehouses or from air seating weavers and spoon and comb boffers, and who are altogether ignorant of household affairs. What is the inevitable consequence? The wages of the husband are not employed to the best advantage. To waste, as a matter of course, succeeds want. Home is made miserable, and in the excitement of company at the public house and in intoxicating drinks, the husband seeks that happiness which he has not at home. Now, I'm not sure if there is a portent of things to come inside Bill and Elizabeth's marriage, but it does give pause for thought. The couple's first baby was born the following February in 1872. The girl was called Anne Elizabeth Godburn, after the mothers of her two parents. Anne, or Annie as she was to be called, didn't have the best of lives. She had a lot of bad luck and a lot of hardship, but I'll deal with that in a later video. The following year, in 1873, my great-grandfather, Frederick Godburn, was born, and according to the birth certificate, the family were now living in Fulton Road. In 1881, the two brothers had families and had apparently settled down. Tom Godburn was now working as a butcher, and he had left the Crofts and he had left the cutlery business. Bill Godburn was living in Pitt Lane with his wife and two children, and everything seemed fine. And then it all started to happen. In 1881, Tom and his family moved across the Atlantic to live next to his sister Harriet in Meriden, which was a town next to where Harriet was living in Wallingford. What happened, I think, is very easy to guess. Harriet must have sent a letter saying how nice it was to be living where they were, that in Wallingford and Meriden there were lots of new companies making all kinds of cutlery and silverware, and they were looking for people to work there with experience. The only thing I don't know is if the company where Tom was later to work offered to help with transport costs, the cost of the voyage and so on. I'm sure that once they arrived in New York, Harriet and Samuel were probably there to meet them. If not in New York, probably in Wallingford, but I think they probably went to New York to accompany them. From New York to New Haven was a 2.5 hour or 3 hour journey, and from New Haven to Wallingford and Meriden was about half an hour. So the hard part was to get to New York. Once in New York, they would have to pass through the immigration center in Castle Garden, and from there they would have to go to the Grand Central Station to catch the train. Then the following year, in 1882, his brother Bill Godburn, my great-great-grandfather, went to join them. But Bill went without his family. And this is where it gets a little confusing for me. The family narrative here in England is that, which was given to me by my grandmother Phoebe Godburn, was that her grandfather did a runner, and to quote my grandmother, he buggered off and abandoned his family in Sheffield. But I'm not 100% sure how that would have worked. What I think happened is that he told his family that he was going to join his brother and sister in America, and that once he'd found his feet and got a job and so on, he would send for them. But he never did. It costs 4 weeks' pay to cross the Atlantic on a ship, and saving that sort of money without anybody knowing would have been very difficult to do. And also, you can't just pack a suitcase and sneak out of the house in the middle of the night and make your way to the rail station and go to Liverpool without your family finding out. But for me, the idea that he went to America promising to send for them makes much more sense. Once in America, Bill lived with his brother and his family until his death in 1830. Another thing that I don't understand is how his brother and sister didn't ask him about his family. It must have been strange at Christmas, for example, when I'm sure all three of them, that's Harriet, Tom and Bill, met for Christmas, had Christmas dinner together with all the families present, that nobody queried the absence of Bill's wife and children. Surely they must have asked where their niece and nephew were and how they were getting on. This is something I don't understand. Harriet died in 1898 and she was buried in the Central Cemetery in Wallingford. As for the two brothers, they worked as cutlery polishers, not grinders. Polishing was a much healthier, much better job, and they were polishing silverware in one of the numerous local silverware factories. In fact, Meriden was world famous for its tableware products. I assume that they lived well, and in all the censuses and local directories, Bill is registered as living with his brother and family. In 1921, belatedly, Bill decided to apply for United States citizenship, or naturalization it was called. I'm not sure why it took him so long, because Tom became a United States citizen early on in the 1880s. If we look at the naturalization papers, they're quite revealing. The handwriting of the clerk on the petition is almost illegible. What we can observe is that Bill arrived in New York on the 12th of August 1882, having left Liverpool on the 1st on the ship City of M something. Now I'm supposing it's the City of Manchester, and if that is so, here is a picture of the ship that he sailed on. He also states that he's single, which he was not. He was either a widow or married, and that is in itself enough to disqualify him. There is also a description of him. It says that he's 5'3", he's 61 years of age, he weighs 140 pounds, which is 10 stone, and that he had blue eyes, which makes him look a little like me, I suppose. Bill never remarried, and that may be due to the danger of him having committed bigamy, which was, and still is, a prison offence both in the UK and in the USA. So he lived and worked in Meriden until his death in 1930. He's buried alongside his brother Tom, who died later in 1935, and alongside his sister-in-law Rose and other members of his brother's family. Back in England, stories circulated in the Godburn family, and especially with my grandmother Phoebe Godburn, that he wore silk shirts while living in America, while his children back in Sheffield ran the streets barefoot in the coldest of weathers. Now, I'm not too sure about the silk shirts that Bill was supposed to have worn, but the latter part of the story was true. He left his family penniless. The images on Google Maps of his address on the corner of Milk Street and Webb show the area to be green and very pleasant. I'm not sure if these houses in the images on Google Maps are the original houses, and I'm really not sure which of these houses that Tom and Bill lived, but they do look palatial in comparison with where they were living in Sheffield. So the Godburn brothers, this was not so much Milk and Webb as the land of milk and honey, and it was a far cry from the slums of the Crofts and the horrors of the cutlery sweatshops in Sheffield. In the next video, I'll be looking at the family that Bill left behind in Sheffield, and in particular his children, his daughter Annie, and my great-grandfather Frederick Godburn.